seemed to have lost its luster, its oomph, its power, even its shock value, if it had any. Writers and movie producers the world over have tantalizingly used it in a multitude of stories and plots to somehow ignite the creative imagination in their audiences, to push us into some kind of thoughtful overdrive. But in actual fact, the fictionalization of resurrection has probably done more to neutralize the importance of the story of Christ's resurrection than just about anything. It's a bit like the economist's law of supply and demand. If there are a whole bunch of resurrections out there, as they increase in number, it would seem they also decrease in value. They become commonplace. After all, what is resurrection if it isn't something we human beings conceive of as something within the range of human experience? Is there anyone who doesn't know what resurrection is? Even little kids learn early on what it is to come back to life with movies like the 1982 E.T. production, the cute little extraterrestrial who comes back to life after dying in an acutely human and somewhat rough world. But his human friend, Elliot, is just beside himself with excitement, and he has to go and tell people what happened. A story often pondered by many to be carrying certain key, acutely Christian threads. And predating E.T. is that story whose writer is accused, or is it accredited, with lifting the essential elements of the Christian story, C.S. Lewis, creator of the Chronicles of Narnia, where Aslan the lion returns to life, and of whom the story reflects, wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roars, sorrows will be no more. We've all seen Narnia, haven't you? Reminiscent of someone we know? Excuse me. Then there is that old 1937 Cary Grant movie called Crocker. You remember it? I'm not that old. Where there's a slightly reckless couple, the Kirby's, who are revived after a bad or a fatal car accident. They're revived to this comical, ghostly appearance. And since in life they did neither good or bad deeds, I guess you could say they sort of wasted their time, they now decide to try to do something good by bringing the slightly boring banker, who's still alive, Cosmo Topper, to know the zestier, spunkier side of life. You know, what life's all about, you might say. It's a cute story. And of course, there are the less genteel stories that gave birth to horror movies about coming back to life, from as far back as Frankenstein up to the current day so-called zombie movies. I'm not into zombie movies myself. The idea of resurrection would seem to be prolific out there. You might remember Michael Jackson's piece that his video with all the zombies approaching. The problem is that we are very inclined to materialize the resurrection. And that, of course, defines it out of existence. It amounts to trying to make the spiritual something material. To put it in succinct terms, like doubting Thomas wanting to put his finger in Jesus' wounds, we are just as guilty of wanting always to be able to literally put our finger on it. And if we can't, we don't think about it. In fact, we sometimes don't even think that it is. And as we know, for many in our society, the spiritual isn't something they attend to. But there are many aspects to human existence and life that are beyond the tangible, but are nonetheless quite real. Like love, respect, faith, trust, hope. Thus, to attend to the spiritual, whether here and now or in the resurrected future, is hardly a waste of our time. It is at the heart of the highest values in life. Our attitudes and disposition in life here and now are profoundly affected and seemingly almost determined about what we think is going to come. Easter, which as you are probably well aware, is somewhat influenced by pagan rituals and thus is not merely coincidentally associated with the seasons of the year and the return of new life. The joy associated with the return of new life in the spring, especially springs like this spring, we're all joyful that it's finally here. It is here, isn't it? The joy associated with the return of new life in the spring is like the egg symbolizing new birth. And that well predates Christianity. The first century Christians no less used the culture of the time than the church uses computers or advertising today. But this, of course, didn't determine what it was all about. It's interesting that there are a number of controversies that have emerged concerning the subject of Easter, which incidentally wasn't actually known or recorded to be celebrated as a feast until about 120 or 130 years after Jesus' death. And at that point, there emerged a difference in opinion as to when this oldest of Christian festivals should take place. In fact, major synods, or church tete-a-tetes, you might call them, were held to resolve the problem, but alas, the Eastern Church was to be divided from the Western on this so-called movable feast of Easter. Here emerged the so-called Paschal controversies. That is, arguments over the date for Easter, whose complexities I'm not going to drag you through this morning, you'll be relieved to know. Suffice it to say that it was affected by the position of the moon, of all things, the Jewish Passover tradition, and the political influences of a world partly centered on Rome and partly centered on Alexandria, Egypt. Then, of course, we have the 40-day Lenten period prior to Easter, traditionally viewed as the cleansing period before the celebration of the Resurrection Day. Thus, Easter is slightly complicated, though it came to some enforced clarity with the famous Church Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, out of which our Nicene Creed is heard in the Church to this day. Incidentally, Paschal is a word with various origins, Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic among them, and in some contexts was considered roughly equivalent in meaning to the Old English word Easter, which also had a history associating it with the goddess of fertility and spring. But in the Jewish-Christian context, it ultimately refers by one thread back to the ritual practice of the sacrifice of the lamb born of the original exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt. Jesus Christ became the new sacrificial lamb, and through his sacrifice, a new order of being was to come into the world. Oh, ours is a rich, albeit somewhat complicated, religious history, all born, it would seem, of just asking even the seemingly straightforward question of, when is Easter? Thus, our faith is not to be oversimplified, but appreciated for its length and breadth and depth, and even its unfathomability. But just because we don't understand things doesn't make them not so. And so, this day, we hear the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What can we say about that? Have we been afforded any greater clarity just on this one thing alone? As you may know, the oldest gospel is that of the writer Mark, who is considered to be the first to offer his account of the story of Christ, including the crucifixion. But here again, we find some controversy. And incidentally, just because there's controversy, this doesn't mean that there isn't something of great value that lay at the bottom of it. In fact, often that is sometimes exactly why there is controversy about it. So what is so controversial about Mark? They say his book begins, or some commentators say his book begins and ends too abruptly. In fact, it ends so abruptly that a redactor, an ancient editor, added a whole section to it, some of which is included in some Bibles. You have a tiny snippet of it in the Bibles you have in your pews. Some suggest, however, that without the addition of these two alternate endings, or without the addition of the new ending, you don't really have a tidy conclusion. The reality of the resurrection, though, and the profound and silent effect of the two women visiting, abruptly ending, as we heard, I think is indicative of something of our understanding. We can't always put it together neatly like some lovely little movie with credits that go down the screen. Is that not true of real life, that the Christian faith sometimes abruptly ends? Who among us is equal to the challenge of fully articulating what is the self-sacrifice of Jesus Christ? What is his love and what is his resurrection? Of course, our inability to describe events does not render them fairy tales either, does it? There are plenty of things we might think about that could well be true, but we cannot put our finger on it. Like that newest star, or newest planet out there on that distant star, what is it, 14 trillion miles, way out there. A planet that's as close to a star as the Earth is to the sun. Well, we can speculate, and they speculate on the potential of there being water on this planet and possible life. It might well be the case. Such is the mystery of the universe we all live in. But with the resurrection, we celebrate not life that we've never seen, nor witnessed, nor had the chance of understanding, but life graciously given to us. Life that we have seen and heard and was sacrificed for us. We know Jesus was born and lived and ministered to us and was crucified, dead, and buried. His resurrection, like the two women, it is enough to render us speechless. An earthly journey, undeniably destined for a heavenly accomplishment. We need to see no more than when we are looking around for further evidence of one who loves us, that they still love us. The fact that we're looking is a bit of a problem. It's so easy to tip into being scientific about everything. And what we speak of here is not what we know, but what we hope for. And that is not based on some idle speculation of our musings on a distant planet. It is on the fact of Christ's resurrection. Of course, as we know, for the Bible tells us so, Jesus was a human being like all of us. But he wasn't just merely human, he was representative of us all in his triumph over death itself. Who can fully and entirely explain life? Is there a movie producer or writer or philosopher or theologian who could so put it together, not necessarily in that order, by the way, who could so put it together as to end all further need to make such offerings? Should it be any different with respect to eternal life?